Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Dress and Drinks. I'm Leon Wiebers. I am the host for this. I'm a faculty member at Loyola Marymount University and a costume designer. The Costume Society of America thanks you for joining us today in Dress and Drinks in our series, Conversations on Dress. Should you have any general questions regarding CSA's digital content, please contact Conversations on Dress at costumesocietyamerica.com. So today I'm very excited to welcome to Dress and Drinks Miranda Bickford. Miranda is a curator at and collections manager of the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center in Powell, Wyoming. For Miranda, dress is a personal affair. Through fashion's history, we're granted an intimate window into the relationships, wishes, and lives of an individual or their community. Bickford's work is an exemplar of dress's power. Her robust background, including 7 different museums throughout her BA, MA, and career, in addition to working with 5 Apache tribes, have prepared her for what was to come. As the collections manager of Heart Mountain Interpretive Center in Powell, Wyoming, her work bears witness to the hardships, ingenuity, and stories of the incarcerated Japanese Americans through clothing. She works firsthand with survivors and descendants of the incarceration of Americans of Japanese ethnicity, as the foundation and museum were started and are still run by survivors and descendants. This amplifies their stories and empowers their communities to preserve and share their history. A personal endeavor indeed, Bickford finds her and the heartfelt stories which come along with every object in the collection the most rewarding part of her job. So please visit the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center the next time you are in Wyoming. So Miranda, please join us today on Dress and Drinks. Miranda, welcome. It's great to have you. It's nice to see you again. It's been a little bit over a year since the Western region had its regional symposium in Cody, Wyoming, which is just outside of Heart Mountain, right near Heart Mountain. And so it was lovely to have lunch with you and to see the exhibit in the center. So really looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, I'm so glad to be here, and I'm glad you guys were able to come visit and I could meet you and this could all happen. It's really exciting.
Yeah, so I will just turn it over to you and let you take it away. I'm sure I will have questions as we go through things, and so will people in our community. So it's all yours.
All right. Like Leon said, I'm Miranda, the collections manager for Heart Mountain, and you can call me Miranda no matter what, and then I use she, her pronouns, so no worries on that. But before we get into dress, I really wanted to talk to you guys about the history of the Interpretive Center and the foundation, which acts as our board and runs the museum. Before the Interpretive Center was built, the Heart Mountain Wyoming Foundation was actually created by former incarcerees and descendants, as well as a couple other interested individuals in 1996, and they obtained their 501c3 status in 97. But as you can see in the top corner, that's our board chair, Shirley Higuchi, and she's actually the daughter of 2 Heart Mountain incarcerees. Doug Nilsson, he actually wrote the first, his doctoral dissertation was the first academically published piece of history on the Heart Mountain Incarceration Camp. But since their meeting and the establishment of the foundation, we have pursued tons of preservation and education opportunities about the Heart Mountain Incarceration Camp and basically the entirety of American incarceration of Japanese people. So today, the foundation is still majority descendants and former incarcerees. And you'll see throughout our museum, we always talk in the first person. So it's like, we did this, I did that. And they like to tell their story through the museum personally. But once a year, you'll see all these photos are kind of in similar places. We host our pilgrimage, where we have former incarcerees, descendants, and other interested parties basically gather to celebrate the resilience of former incarcerees, but also educate themselves about Japanese incarceration and what the Foundation Interpretive Center have been doing. So in the top right corner, you'll see our Heart Mountain babies. Those are just a few of the 500 people who were actually born at Heart Mountain during the 3 years that it was in operation. And at the bottom, you have some of our former incarcerees as well as our staff. So this is our interpretive center. But basically, after years of fundraising, our interpretive center opened in 2012. And the building actually looked like the first top corner picture with the 3 barracks and the flag. That was the original building. And It consists of a timeline exhibit it's a fully permanent exhibit that goes from basically the anti-Asian racism beginning prior to Pearl Harbor all the way through the reparations and the founding of the foundation. And then we just recently had a huge expansion of our museum, which you'll see in the top right. So you'll see we added a fourth barrack and what we call the Minetta Simpson Institute, which I'll get into more later, which is the oddly shaped part on the side, basically, for you guys to know. But the center just goes over different parts of life in the museum. The museum just goes over different parts of life at what was once called the Relocation Center. And so you'll see in the bottom left, that's our empty barrack room, which appears as how incarcerees would have found their new homes when they arrived. And in the bottom, in the other side, you have what the incarcerees made of these homes, a recreation. And a lot of the items in that room are actually former incarcerees' belongings that people get to witness for themselves. So quick overview of the Minetta Simpson Institute.
Oh, wow.
This is our new space. We're very excited. And it's going to be our grand opening will be at this year's pilgrimage at the end of July. So in the top left, you have the outside of the Simpson Institute. And so those two windows actually look out onto Heart Mountain, which is a huge part of the art that was made at camp. And then you'll see in the top right is our lecture hall. And so this whole institution was actually made over the friendship of Norman Minetta and Al Simpson. And Norman Minetta was actually Norman Minetta was an incarceree at Heart Mountain as a child, and then he went on to become George Bush's Secretary of Transportation. And well, Al Simpson was a local Cody boy, and they actually met at camp when their respective Boy Scout troops co-hosted a jamboree at Heart Mountain Camp, and they shared a tent. And then they re-met on Capitol Hill. One is a senator from Wyoming and one is a senator from California. So it's really a beautiful friendship that they blossomed and had throughout basically their entire lives until Norm died in 2022. So the bottom two photos are the exhibit that they'll be the entrance into the lecture hall that you see in the top photo. Then what you guys will be interested in is our collections expansion. So originally on the left side, that was our original collection space, and it still kind of looks like that because I haven't got everything moved over yet. But it was just the third barrack, the back half of the third barrack of our original building was collections. And now we've expanded into that fourth barrack, which now the back half of the fourth barrack and the space that connects them is all mine. So that's super exciting. I call it my little dungeon. So I love to just hide out in there with all my pretty things, but we were really
That's
excited to
amazing.
do
That's
this.
a really fantastic expansion and very exciting. That's awesome.
We are so excited. It was a huge upgrade, and we can now actually have space for like larger pieces. So we're working with Sacramento State actually to get a handmade desk and Buddhism sent over from there that were actually made at
Wow.
Heart Mountain and connected to other incarceration camps as well. So we'll actually have space for the beautiful items that were made at our camp. So just so you guys have a little idea, in the original space, I'm actually going to make that all of our large object holding. So we have like a large laundry sink, a wheelchair. Those two new furniture items will all go in there once I get all that out. And then that black shelving you see in the original photo will go into the middle space. And that will be our institutional archive, which is like the foundation's history and such. And then lastly, you see our very fancy high density shelving that I'm so excited about. It got installed literally 2 weeks ago.
Oh,
Literally
wow,
two
that's
weeks ago that
fantastic.
got
That's
installed.
fantastic. Oh,
Thank
and it
you.
probably triples your storage ability.
Yes. Like I probably more. I usually say triples though, just to like be humble about it. But we're so excited for that one. So yeah, that'll be our space. And then the bottom photo is actually my little workspace where I work with accessioning items and taking photos and can lay out larger pieces on those tables. But yeah. So the Interpretive Center itself has quite a few historic structures on its grounds. And so the first one is our barrack. So this is actually an original barrack that was donated to Heart Mountain, and it stands like just behind the museum. And so you have if you're staying at the barrack, you have a beautiful view of Heart Mountain as well as the museum. But when you go inside, that's what the bottom photo is. And that space is actually at least two separate rooms that families of 2 to 6 people would have lived in. And we're using it as a lecture space and like an overall exhibit over the barracks. But there's 3 more rooms that we're turning into living exhibits that are going to be based off of different incarcerees, memories, photos, and things like that. And so we're going to have one over our board member, Bacon Sakatani. We're looking for a woman who lived in that type of particular room. And then the last one will be for Nogan Zenzaki, who was a Rinzai monk that lived at Heart Mountain. And he turned his personal room into basically a religious space for people to come and meditate. So that'll be
Oh,
our barrack. And then on
so
the other
actually,
go
Miranda, I
ahead.
have a question. So what do you mean the barrack was donated to you? So
So
federal government or?
no, so actually the barracks, I'll kind of get this into this later. The barracks were all bought and sold out, and so you'll see them across the Wyoming landscape. But this barrack in 2015, along with the second one, were donated to the foundation. We gave one to Janum, so that's one that lives within the Janum Museum, kind of more in an original state, and then we're updating ours to look like what it would have been like when the incarcerees lived in it. So yeah,
Gotcha.
they were actually housing in Shell, Wyoming for, I believe, field like graduate students doing field work in the area.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Because this was still under construction, I think, when I was there last year, as well as the add-on to the interpretive center.
Yeah.
It's so many plastic walls and boxes and things. It was great.
Yes, we had quite the endeavor of last summer, but it's all working out now. So we're very excited to actually open it up to the public. And then on the right side we have our honor roll, which is, I don't know why I put root cellar on that slide. That's my bad. But our honor roll, and that's actually an original structure that was built by incarcerees to honor those who served in World War II, and so includes not only former incarcerees but also white employees who left the camp to also do that. So this is the actual root cellar. This is our most current endeavor, and so this was donated to the museum, the land that it's on as well, and we're currently having a historic restoration team coming in, and they're basically making it safe for people to go in without having to have hard hats and everything on. And they're out of Missoula, Montana, but they've been working on this for like almost since 2018. And so this is hopefully going to be our last summer of like full construction before we can have actual visitors go in. And so it's about 300 feet long and 40 wide, and there are
Wow.
actually two on site, but one has sadly like decayed so much that it's not safe to go in. But actually, when you walk all the way to the back of this photo, there's actually a car that's just stored back there that we have no clue about what it's doing. But so that's
Oh,
one, and then eventually, once all the construction's done, we're going to put an ADA accessible exhibit in there for people to actually go in and see interpretation about the root cellar as well. Yeah.
do you elaborate? I mean, the root cellar is an amazing, interesting story. Do you elaborate on this later on? And I sort of feel like I'm cheating my audience because I know. So, or could you elaborate on the root cellar and why it exists and how that came about?
Yeah. So I can talk about that now. So basically, the Heart Mountain incarcerees, when they came, they were just basically living on rations and what had been provided, food that was provided by the government. And then, if you all know who Judge Lance Ito is, his father and mother were incarcerated at Heart Mountain. And his dad actually started the Heart Mountain Agricultural Department, and they ended up farming the whole area surrounding camp. So the camp itself was basically 1 square mile. They had almost up to 10 square miles of farmland that they irrigated and took care of and cultivated into so much food that they had to build these two root cellars that they crafted incarcerees alone to create this just to store their food. And so actually when you go down there, it could be like 95 degrees outside or negative 30, and it'll be like a brisk 60 degrees in there. And so there's actually War Authority photos of like them driving trucks of vegetables into the root cellar at Heart Mountain. Yeah.
When I was there and learned that story, I was just like, oh my God, they built this amazing thing. And by the end, by after a year or so, as I remember, they began selling the produce to businesses in Cody, correct?
They started selling their vegetables, but also sending them off to other camps as well.
Oh, right. Wow.
And then just so you guys know, the top photo is actually the vents that go down into the root cellar that allow the air to circulate. Yeah. And then we can switch to the next slide if you guys are ready. So in front of the interpretive center, we have the hospital where it stood. So this is actually up on the hill behind the interpretive center. And this is all Bureau of Rec land, but we are proudly stewards of this land, and we're actually in talks with them to hopefully one day purchase this from them. So these are the 3 remaining buildings of the hospital, as well as a smokestack. And we haven't been able to do much work on it, but in 2013 we were able to restore the chimney to keep it from falling over. But this is a really big part of what locals remember about the Heart Mountain Camp, because these are the buildings that actually didn't get removed, and they've been there since the 1940s. And so whenever you talk to a local about Heart Mountain, they're like, oh yeah, the smokestack, you can see it from the highway when you're on your way from Cody to Powell. And it's a really iconic look, because you look over, you have the interpretive center, you look over us, you see the hill, the smokestack, and then the mountain. It's a really beautiful shot. Okay, so that's basically our grounds and what the museum is, and I wanted to give you guys that short introduction because I'm assuming most of you have never been to Wyoming, and that's okay. Neither had I before I worked here. So, but before I get into the full dress, I just want to talk about our collection. And so we are basically a cross-boundary space. We collect anything that comes from, whether it be post-incarceration, during incarceration, and sometimes pre-incarceration, depending on the individual. But as our museum grows, our collection is still growing. So we're very young, only opening in 2012 with our now 7,000 about piece collection. And only 40 pieces of that are basically clothing, with most of it being military items as well as baby clothes, but each piece shows a really unique part of camp life, and that's, as Leon said, that's one of my favorite pieces. So you'll get a touch of history with each piece, because it's either like the person who wore that in camp donating it, or it's the son of someone who donated that, and they can have those photos that relate to what that person's life was at Heart Mountain. And so, yeah. How we got to Heart Mountain is a really interesting story, but basically the United States had a really large growing bout of anti-Asian racism starting in the 1850s when the Chinese immigrants started arriving, and then in the 1860s when Japanese immigrants came. And this is because of the cheap labor costs, as you all know, of Chinese and Japanese workers, but as well as their success in areas of like farming and fishing, as they were coming from those villages that were overpopulated in their respective countries and coming here where the land was land of the free, and being able to have all that opportunity, they were very well outselling their white neighbors. And so by the time that Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, the anti-Asian hate was just absolutely rampant, especially on the West Coast where they were most concentrated. And so basically immediately after word reached the mainland about Pearl Harbor, Japanese immigrants and natural-born American citizens of Japanese descent faced much hate and violence at the hands of their white neighbors and fellow countrymen. And not long after that word reached the mainland, basically military officials and local police were just gathering up all Japanese men who posed a threat. And so that basically means anyone who was like a leader in their community. So you could have been like a church pastor, or you could have like ran the local Boy Scout troop, or a grocery worker. And it didn't really matter. It just was basically an all-out, you're deemed as a threat, so you're going to go to jail without due process. They had no formal reasoning. They were just deemed as like a security threat. And so following that, on February 19th, 1942, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, giving all generals in the U.S. the authority to forcibly remove people of Japanese descent from their sectors. The U.S. is divided up into 5 sectors at the time. And the only general who decided that was DeWitt, and he commanded the Western Defense Command. And so that's basically like half of Oregon, half of Washington, all of California, and Alaska. And so his decision to do that forced the incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of those being people who had not maybe only lived the majority of their lives in the U.S., but also their entire life, because they were natural-born U.S. citizens, the Nisei generation. And so in the bottom left, you'll see the instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry. These were posted up across the West Coast, telling people what they were allowed to bring to detention centers, where they were allowed to go, what they were allowed to do, and the different items and what instructions they had to follow prior to being bused to the detention centers. So in the image above that is actually a Dorothea Lange photo of policemen checking over people's bags before they get on the bus to their respective detention centers. At the time, as I said, they were called assembly centers. And those are basically temporary places that they held Japanese people before they were carted off to places like Heart Mountain, which were being built at that time by the military and other local folks who've been hired. In the bottom right is actually one of the trains arriving at Heart Mountain, full of incarcerees. And so that was taken by Jack Richard, and he was basically a well-known local Yellowstone photographer, but he also arrived and took photos of people at camp. And you'll see later on, we have more of his photos that he was hired to take of incarcerees, of their large life events. And then the top image is actually identification tag, which is one that would have been attached to every single incarceree. And it displayed their family number, so the 27776, and then their name and where they were to report to. So that would have been tied around buttons on coats, attached to your suitcase, and you wouldn't have been able to roam around your detention center or travel to your newly found relocation center or assembly center without it. And that's how they tracked everyone. So these are two beautiful pieces that we have in our collection. And so what to carry or leave behind was a really hard question that a lot of them faced. And so with those 120,000 people leaving for incarceration, they had to either abandon their established lives with only what they could carry. And so this purple yukata is actually a summer unlined kimono, and it was taken with a family to camp. And so they kept that as a very valuable piece of their tradition. But in other cases, you have the actual kimono on the right was owned by the Hoshizaki family, and they left it with their trusted neighbors, the Marshalls. And so the Marshalls basically went above and beyond honoring that family's wishes and their land and property, monitoring it. And they even collected rent from those tenants that they had arranged to live in the Hoshizaki home. And so, but that was like a beautiful piece that we had an temporary exhibit over, I think when you were here, Leon. But most families did not have the privilege of non-Japanese families who they were really close to that were allowed to stay on the West Coast. So either they had friends and neighbors they left stuff with, and they were left victims of theft by either those friends that they trusted or just general people who saw that they had to leave their things. Or you'll have theft in other ways where you'll have a white farmer walk up to a Japanese farmer and he'll be like, I'll buy your whole farm for $100. And that's your only offer. It's either you leave and he takes it anyways, or you get the $100. And so it was just absolute robbery of their land and items as well.
Yes, I remember the exhibit that you had at the time really focused on the West region in Los Angeles.
Yes.
And I'm from the not the West Edition, but
We refer
and
to it as J flats, is what we
the J
refer
Flat,
to it as.
yes. And It was very interesting because I was like, oh my God, I've traveled all this way to Cody, Wyoming to learn all about this in Los Angeles and this particular neighborhood, which I've driven through many times.
No, and most of our incarcerees were actually from Los Angeles in that area as they went to Pomona and Santa Anita Racetrack, which they're the respective assembly centers that most of our incarcerees came from. So it was mostly like neighborhoods that came together, and they were
Right.
friends and neighbors that were like neighbors in the barracks as well. And so it was really interesting to see how we're so connected to Los Angeles in that way, despite being in the middle of Wyoming. So, adjusting to camp life was really hard, and as those incarcerees arrived starting on August 12th, 1942, they moved into these newly and poorly built barracks that had actually been made out of green lumber, and so it hadn't shrunk yet. And so, as it shrunk, it left holes in the walls and the floors. And so, you see that there's two photos of basically metal nailed into the ground. So, those are holes that would have been in the lumber or created for other reasons that they covered with pieces of metal to keep either snow or dust or bugs or any other things from coming into their new homes. And so all of our incarcerees are from the West Coast, and so Wyoming was really a rude awakening for them as it had not only like hot, dusty summer, so we're like in the high 90s, horrendous wind. There's like no trees here, so it's like horrible dust. But then in the winters, it was even worse because none of them had experienced really snow or the horrible temperatures. And that winter of 1942 into 43 was actually the worst on Wyoming's record. And so the photos of snow are actually from 44, I will admit, but that's like a standard Wyoming winter. And you can see on the barrack, most of the snow has melted off. And that's because all of the heat from their stoves rose up into the rafters, as there were no ceiling. It was just the roof as that ceiling. So all the heat rose to the rafters, and your walls didn't even go to the rafters. So you had little kids climbing up the walls and looking over into their neighbor's barrack room. And so in that winter, most adults and children didn't have the coats and appropriate, like whether where they needed. So the Army had to end up handing out just like standard private's jackets for everyone to stay warm. But you also had instances where someone would create these earmuffs that are in the center. And so these are actually created by Name Hoshizaki, who is the mother of Takashi Hokozaki that we'll talk about later, and related to the family with the kimono. You'll see a theme. But she had 6 kids at the time, and so she used these and others to like keep her children's ears warm. But you also see mothers creating like the snowsuit in the corner. And so they were all basically desperate to find ways to keep warm, and they also had to leave their barracks not only for everyday life for their jobs, but also there were no bathrooms or laundry facilities or any way to create food in your home. So you had to leave your barrack and walk across the Wyoming landscape to get to your mess hall or your laundry facilities and your bathrooms. So leaving barracks was very common, and you had to dress warm often, not only inside, but as well as out. So with that, just the wooden box, you had people desperate to create those clothes as I showed you. And so another way people had those created clothes was ordering from the Sears Roebuck catalog. And so these were everywhere across camp. And you'll have people not only ordering clothes, but also just fabric to create it. So these 2 pieces, the yellow one, it has strawberries across it, is actually fabric that they ordered from the Sears catalog. And it has like a waffle texture, if that makes any sense. But you had mothers hand making clothes from those materials that they bought. And although there were some stores at camp, they also didn't have as many options. It was limited, and Cody and Powell weren't very welcoming places, let alone somewhere that you could get as much as you needed as they were used to in a place like Los Angeles. And so that's a children's one-piece jumper. And then the middle picture is actually a handmade apron for a child, also made from a curtain that they had bought through the catalog.
So I remember from the visit, how did they have money if they've left everything behind? And there's a really wonderful story about Sears and Roebuck's that I recall.
Yes, so everyone was allowed, well, all the Nisei were allowed to have jobs. Issei not as much, not as often, and very dependent on what your citizenship looked like and such, and like where you were born and things like that. But jobs were basically, you had to have one on camp, but you weren't paid as well as you would be off site in your jobs other ways. So you had people basically organizing, you had people working in the hospital, you had people working for the WRA directly in like recreational ways, you had people as school teachers and in firefighter positions and so on. So they were paid in that way, but they didn't make any amount of money in comparison to what you would have made outside of camp. And then for Sears, actually, so there was a huge influx of orders, clearly, to somewhere in Wyoming called Heart Mountain, because at the time it was treated as basically its own town. And so your address would have been like Barrack 26A, Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and it would be mailed to the site. And so the CEO was like, who is ordering all of this stuff from the middle of Wyoming? And so there's actually a story of where he flew out to come visit Heart Mountain to see where all of this influx of money was coming from and saw what they were going through. And so it was really interesting to see the juxtaposition of how much they benefited, not only like Wyoming and the towns surrounding them, but also corporations like that throughout their incarceration and like their willingness to survive through that. So these are 2 of my favorite pieces. These handmade getas are actually a very large part of Japanese culture. And so traditional cultures were very regulated by the War Relocation Authority who ran camp, but they were not lost at all during incarceration. Only limited communities would host sumo wrestling events, Japanese dance performances, and more. And this easily translated to their clothes as they wanted to keep as much of their tradition alive within this really hostile environment that was really struggling and pursuing them to let it go and like basically become a part of white culture in this alienated space. And so these gettas, like much of the furniture has been made at Heart Mountain and other camps, as well as much of we have a lot of wood carvings in our collection, were all made from scrap wood. So this could have been like scrap lumber. One of these is made from a crate that would have like stored food they brought for the kitchen. And then you also had sometimes leftover lumber that were made from the barracks. And so both of these are made at camp. And then furthermore, personalization and the Wyoming life and its climate really changed how they adapted to traditions as well. And so the top pair, you'll see it has those leather covers on it, and that was hand tacked on with brass tacks along the edges, basically to keep all the sand out from this person's toes, which I find is so sweet and such a piece of humanity in that, because I also hate sand between my toes. But the maker of both of these pairs is actually unknown because an antiques dealer in Cody found them in an abandoned barrack basically in a field out on someone's property one day and brought them to us to donate. So yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I've never seen the leather cover on Gaeta, so that's fascinating.
Yes, I love that part. It was so much fun when I found them. I was like, oh, there's just so much humanity in that little additional piece. So scouts were a huge part of life, not only like in the 1940s, but like within Heart Mountain. And so despite living basically behind a barbed wire fence, the community at Heart Mountain and other camps didn't let that rob their children of a really fulfilling childhood. And we actually have a lot of statements from Nisei and like former incarcerees who were kids saying like they didn't understand the struggle that they were in because they were just hanging out with their neighbors and their best friends who lived next door instead of understanding the greater picture, because that's all that childhood innocence. So beautiful. But as scouts were removed from their original troops, and they were forcibly removed from the West Coast, their parents and former troop members actually reactivated 13 Boy Scouts and 1 Girl Scout troop at Heart Mountain alone. And then these groups
Wow.
basically, yeah, it was a huge amount. And we have tons of photographs of scouts doing various activities. But these groups would actually go swimming in the swimming hole within the farmland at camp. They'd visit the Shoshone River, which runs by. They'd also hike and camp on Heart Mountain, which was just behind the farmland at camp. And then lastly, they also took a lot of pride in their Americanhood and their nationality in America, as that was a large part of incarceration, was that battle between like I am an American even though you don't see me as one. And so the Boy Scout troops would actually raise the American flag every single day and lead the Pledge of Allegiance. And so that's what the photo is them actually leading that ceremony. And then I'll say the aft cap, was actually worn by Hiroshi Bill Shushima during his time at Heart Mountain. And then the neckerchief was worn by Mei Mitsuko Kudosudo. And so she actually her and her mother hand embroidered the Girl Scout troop like logo on the very bottom, which is really sweet. And we actually have a lot of handmade like Boy Scout flags that they made as like for their little troops and also like their little groups within those as friend groups. And so there's one with like skulls and crossbones. There's one with like snakes on it to represent all their different parts of life at Heart Mountain. And so, as you guys know, Alan, Norm also met as Boy Scouts. And so that's a huge part of their exhibit and their lives, and basically just talking about how their connection formed at Heart Mountain. And they were part of these troops that really changed life at Heart Mountain, as these troops not only gave something for the kids, but they gave something for the adults to also lead these activities and give them a lot of meaning with the time that they didn't have much. And so you'll see a lot of Issei participants in these groups, like leading their grandsons and daughters throughout these activities that they learned to do basically back home. So it was really beautiful. Scouts weren't the only recreational activities. There were other recreational activities that were for everyone at camp for the most part. And so a really big part of the years 1944 and 1945 was the Heart Mountain Eagles high school football team. And so they were required to play all of their games at the incarceration camp. And so you'll see the high school in the background of that photo with the chimney stack. And very few teams are willing to not only travel, Wyoming's a fairly vast place, but also just enter the camp alone. These white teams weren't willing to do that. And so only, I believe, 7 teams ever entered Heart Mountain Camp willing to play. But when they found a team that was actually willing to play, they would walk onto a field basically surrounded by like 2,000 to 4,000 incarcerees who were there to watch not only like their friends' sons, their grandsons, and so on play, but also just a team who they could root for and take pride in this American pastime as well as their community. And so it was a really intimidating process for them to go in there and not only enter behind the barbed wire fence and see the reality of what America's doing, but also really intimidating crowd if we're just thinking about it. And so it was a team of just 30 players who played 7 games during its 2-season run, but it has a winning record of 6-1, the best in Wyoming state history. Probably never to be beat, because I just don't know if the odds could ever happen. But that photo is actually of George Horse Yoshinaga's Heart Mountain letter, and that's him right behind the guy who's catching the football. And so that's his Heart Mountain letter. He played clearly in the football and the basketball team at Heart Mountain High School. And we also have like his certificate letter that would have been given to him at the ceremony. And the images of their final game the Eagles played, the only one they lost, which was against a school from Casper. So it was like a huge city for Wyoming. And they had this really large team coming in, but they only lost by like 1 point. So it was a really beautiful thing to see how hard they worked and how much morale they gave to their community. And then on the other side, we have the ice skates that was in the introductory video of me, or like images of me. And so ice skating was a super popular activity. And once that swimming hole freezed up, that had become an ice skating area. But they'd also, in the photo, you can see, they just dumped water in between the barracks. And they would create their own ice skating rinks for everyone to use. And so in addition to this men's pair, we have 5 others in our collection of ice skates.
Wow.
Yeah, and so a lot of descendants will actually talk about how their parents took them to go ice skating back on the West Coast, wherever they moved to after incarceration, and tell them about how they learned when they were in Heart Mountain. So it's a really beautiful thing that they got to pass down of fun through generations. So adults had tons of recreational activities that were offered through the recreation department, through the WRA, but they included lots of arts and crafts. And so they also had flower arranging, bonsai, calligraphy, haiku poetry, games of go and shigo. And then the men really enjoyed like woodworking classes, furniture building, but the women did a lot of sewing, embroidery, and design classes. And you also see at other camps, they had like fashion design classes where they would have shows and they'd walk down. So there's a lot of WRA photos of that as well. It did not happen at Heart Mountain, but we had a huge embroidery class. And so the top piece, as its creator is unknown, but it's a very common piece that we have through our collection. So as they were assignments to learn different stitches, we'll have like 6 of the same embroidery, but you'll see the slight differences between the different artists who made it. And then the bottom piece was created by Shishiko Kurosawa, who made this piece as well as 6 others throughout her time at Heart Mountain. But her daughter said that the mom's embroidery teacher would actually hand dye a lot of her thread. So she would be able to make different pieces from the rest of the class with variants in her thread types and colors and give her a wider range to create more beautiful photos. And then the bag is not a class, but this was something that her name was Asana Ota, and she actually created the knit bag just in her free time outside of work and other classes and things she was doing, but she actually hand painted her name on it and then an image of Heart Mountain as well. This is probably one of my favorite slides. So baby clothes is a huge thing in our collection, as they were usually worn by our donors who then gift them to us with photos like this one, which are so sweet. And so at Heart Mountain, over 550 babies were born at our hospital during its operation, basically from 42 to 45. And its
Wow.
staff, yeah, we had a lot of babies. We like to say there wasn't much else to do. So there's a lot of families and a lot of recently married people who have been relocated to Heart Mountain. But at the hospital, the staff was majority male Japanese doctors with white female nurses. And there was with how we were talking about pay earlier, the huge discrepancy in that was that none of the incarcerees could be paid more than a private in the Army. And so that meant that the white nurses were paid about $150 a month, but those Japanese doctors they worked under were only paid $19 a month, which was the most anyone could make as an incarceree at camp. And so back to the baby clothes. These 4 pieces were all worn by Karishiba Imai. And so her mother made the hat and the dress, handmade in camp, just yellow, basically almost like wool yarn. And then her mother made those for her, and that's like her in the cute photo along with the white shoes there in the top. And then both of those shoes were actually bought through the Sears catalog once they had arrived at camp throughout incarceration. Yeah. And the little black shoes at the bottom have like hand painted flowers on them. So I don't know if those were like an addition or if they're just like rubbing off due to, but they're very adorable. And it's like a little tiny yellow, pink, and blue flowers that have been added.
A very sweet little dress.
It is, and I love the little hat. It has like a little
Yeah.
poof ball on the top, and it's so cute. So these are some of my favorite images we have in our collection. Basically, incarceration threatened and did not make a large impact on marriage, but it made a large impact on traditional Japanese family values as people were forced to go to the mess hall instead of having family meals and such. But a lot of couples who weren't married prior to incarceration rushed into marriage as they didn't want to be divided up between different camps. And so, although they did not get married prior to incarceration, Kyoko and Shigeru actually got married in the first marriage to ever occur at Heart Mountain, Wyoming, in their barrack. And so the middle image is actually the announcement that Kyoko's brother sent out. And so you'll see that they got married at their home in barrack 20, I'm pretty sure that says 6A at Heart Mountain, Wyoming. So that's like a traditional address. And then the 2 images are actually from our Jack Richard collection I was talking about earlier. And so they had 2 ceremonies, the traditional Japanese ceremony, as well as like a traditional American wedding. And so the image of her in her traditional wear with her husband was taken in their barrack as like their formal photos after the wedding. And then the other image is her in her American wear, but photos taken prior to the wedding. And that's actually a proof that she had ordered back from him to like decide what they actually wanted to order through Jack. And so I think that was a really fun way to get a glimpse into the intimacies of like life operating normally at Heart Mountain. Because like I just got married last August, and so I went through this whole process. Now my proofs were digital, but it was really cool to see that we have done the same things and we've had the same processes in life. And so I thought that was a really beautiful way of seeing how they could hire this local white man, to take care of their big milestone events.
Right.
In this image, you'll see Etsu Mineta Masoka, who was incarcerated alongside her family, including her younger brother Norman Mineta, who I had mentioned earlier. And so her husband, as you see in the image, is actually Mike Masoka, who was the first national secretary and later Washington, D.C. representative of the Japanese American Citizens League. And they met on a bus on their way to a JACL conference in 1941. And so immediately following Pearl Harbor, Mike was actually incarcerated in North Platte, Nebraska, where he was actually recruiting for members of the JACL. And then he was released and sent back to Salt Lake City, where his family was living at the time. But she was sent to Heart Mountain with her family, and then in 1943, she moved to join him to get married in Salt Lake. But prior to her leaving, a bunch of women in camp actually gathered and created this wedding suit for her to wear on her big day. And so this was handmade by like multiple women at Heart Mountain, which is a really beautiful piece. And then that's her in the suit on their wedding day.
Wow.
I love this suit, and it was so exciting to find a photo of it. So basically, Heart Mountain was a self-sustaining community regulated by minimal WRA staff. So they filled all those necessary roles, including police and firemen. And so the firemen in our Heart Mountain site were actually really well known, ended up helping Cody Police and firemen put out a fire on Cedar Mountain, and were actually ranked the 26th amongst all American communities who participated in the 1943 Fire Prevention Week. And they're the first ever to be ranked from Wyoming. And so that bottom hat is a fireman's hat. You can see Heart Mountain, it was basically HMRC, Heart Mountain Relocation Camp, Firefighter 21. And so we had our own truck and everything, but that hat was actually found in the hospital buildings that I showed you earlier in the 80s by locals who were just kind of like scavenging through. And then the policeman's hat was worn by Thomas Kime, who is actually, if you look in the photo, you see the one guy in like the third row in the dark shirt. So that's him wearing his hat alongside his fellow policemen, and his son, Hal, had donated that to us.
I do have a question for you, Miranda. One thing that really struck me was the jewelry that was made at Heart Mountain.
A lot of the jewelry was mostly like handmade brooches. And we have a few other pieces. We have like a pendant for a necklace. We have, I think, a brooch set with matching earrings, but it was all handmade in those crafts classes that were made of shells that they had bought or different pieces they found around camp, and as well as like carved out of wood. So the pendant's actually a monkey that someone carved out of a peach pit. And then we have other pieces that are basically like on a wood slab, and then it's all been glued on top. And so it's like different flower arrangements and things like that. We also have a lot of wood carved butterflies. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember those. Yes. So I have a question that's maybe a tough question, but it's sort of to get us kicked off on this. This history has often been ignored in, U.S. history classes and teaching about it. And I think many times these camps are compared to concentration camps of the same time period. How do you, at Heart Mountain, reconcile that comparison and contextualize what this is within it? I mean, obviously, what the U.S. government did was terrible and horrible. And there was a lot of loss of personal property. But I'm curious about how, as an interpretive center, you address those things.
Basically, originally, Heart Mountain, like camps like Heart Mountain, were called American concentration camps because they are a concentrated group of people being illegally detained, basically. But once incarceration camps from Germany and Eastern Europe were coming out, the U.S. basically shoved that name under the rug and changed it to relocation camps. And so, in the way of, how do I say this? Like literally what they have like the same definition, but with our understanding since post World War II and the discovery of what Germany had and the Nazi Party had did to Jewish people and others, we have changed it to an incarceration camp because they were all illegally, without due process, basically incarcerated within that. And so we do a lot of comparison between what Germany did and what America did. And although no, there were not forced death and there was not forced labor, it was a removal from your home and loss of everything that you had. And so it's in that way, it's like we respect the trauma and the loss of life that occurred in Germany due to the Nazi Party, but we also acknowledge that that's what Americans had originally called it, and that's what they had intended, even though their intent was not obliteration of a race. It was obliteration of their Americanness and their rights. And so that's how we compare. And that's why the terms have gone from like concentration to relocation to internment, which is a completely separate word that we push away from, as that's a legal operation of a government being able to intern those who are not welcome basically in their country, versus incarceration. We call it an illegal incarceration camp.
Because it's, I've heard through and read through any number of sources of that comparison. And, I was like, well, that's yes, but in some ways that I've really been thinking about that, especially since visiting Heart Mountain. You talked about other things in the exhibit and in the museum, but there's so many other textiles that are used in it. I mean, everything from like the mattresses to like coverlets and things like that. So how and how many so this is in the West, how many incarceration camps were there, or internment camps were there?
So,
And how many still exist as interpretive sites?
So Heart Mountain is the types like Heart Mountain. There are 10, and so there's multiple: California, one in Colorado, one in Idaho, us, a couple in Arkansas, and 2 in Arizona. But there were other forms as well. So like Fort Missoula, Montana, it also incarcerated Japanese individuals. And then there's Crystal City that's down in Texas, but that was Japanese individuals as well as German and Italian individuals. And so there's a wide range. As for interpretive centers, as of this moment, we are the only privately owned foundation and interpretive center, but you have Manzanar in California, you have Amachi, which is also called Granada, which is in Colorado. That's an MPS site. Just recently, this year, not sure 2024, but like since last year at this time. You also have Minidoka, which is in Idaho, and then the two sites in Arkansas are kind of ran through Arkansas State as like a miniature museum, and
Mm,
every single site basically, other than the two in Arizona, have like friends of organizations that also like run their pilgrimages and such. But the two in Arizona were, when they were formed, were on reservation land that was then taken back by the federal government, and they were housed there. And then when they abandoned the camp, there's like, oh, you can have it again. And so you basically have to work with the respective tribes to get access. So there's no really like site to visit, but they are fairly warm and welcoming to especially pilgrimages and descendants returning. So
So talk about the pilgrimage. You've mentioned this now a few times. What is the pilgrimage and who participates in it? Things of that nature.
So our pilgrimage is the last weekend in July. I believe this year it's the 25th through the 27th. It's a Thursday through a Saturday. So this year's special because we're having a grand opening of MSI and everything, but traditionally it's that 3-day process where former incarcerees and descendants mostly do come, but it's also welcome to any interested parties. And it's basically a weekend of like educational content. We have speakers, we have workshops. So they're doing an intergenerational trauma workshop this year. They're doing, we have like a silent auction and fundraising things, but also we have large speakers come in. So Al Simpson will be coming again this year to be honored by the building that we named after him and Norm. And we have like a large tent that we set up at the Interpretive Center. We also host tours like of the root cellar, the barrack, of the whole museum and things like that. So it's really just, we try to look at it as basically a large weekend where all those people can come together and honor those with the resilience that the incarcerees had, but also those who, the descendants who are still dealing with the repercussions of incarceration and how well that they have powered through and created the lives that they do have today.
If you are going to visit Yellowstone this summer on one of your national park tours, Heart Mountain is, you're like an hour from Yellowstone?
Yeah, so we're an hour outside of the west entrance of Yellowstone.
Yeah. So an easy drive and really, really well worth it. I can't recommend it enough. It was such an eye-opening experience and really well curated and put together. The rooms that you've recreated in those spaces with the garments. I mean, that's exactly where this came from. It was like, I had no idea. This is so amazing. And really the exhibition is really, it ties all of those things so nicely together in terms of, the space, the location, the garments, all of that. And this is just a tip of the iceberg of the things that you have. Miranda, I want to thank you so much for this today, and feel free to, I hope the pilgrimage goes really well this year. The work that Heart Mountain is doing, it was really, really, I mean, I was completely surprised by it, and I will totally come back. I can't wait I would love to go through the root cellar. So whenever that's ready to go, I'm like, ooh, I want to go. Always learning so much from it, and the objects that you've shown today were very simple things, but really actually very meaningful and just wonderful. That little yellow dress is just going to stay with me. It was so sweet.
So
Um,
sweet.
and the gaita. So thank you so much for your time today.